Do you really understand the core Azure architecture and services? Concepts like Azure data centers, Azure availability zones, Azure regions, regional pairs are some of the concepts that you must understand much before you start building any solution on Azure Cloud. Hello and welcome back to the Tech Blackboard. In today's video, we are going to cover the very basics of Azure core architecture. In today's episode 8, we are going to cover describe Azure regions, region pairs, sovereign regions, and please note that this is the latest change done on the 28th of October 2022. To understand all such changes done in AZ-900, you can watch this video that I published some days back. We will then cover describe the availability zones, and finally we will understand describe Azure data centers. I will cover the section 2.1.4 till 2.1.7 in the next part. Now you can see that although Azure data center is the section 2.1.3, but I would like to start today's episode with Azure data centers. One reason is that I have already explained Azure data centers in quite some details in the previous parts, so it's easy for you to understand. The second but more prominent reason is that data centers is the smallest building block of the core architectural component of Azure. So I will first brief you on the data centers and then we will build up towards Azure availability zones and Azure regions. You can check the previous parts of this series for a complete understanding of data centers and how they work. So let's begin with the data centers. Now there are so many services in Azure Cloud. So when you provision any service in Azure, for example, let's say that you provision a database or maybe a virtual machine, or it can also be a global website. Where are all these services hosted? The answer is servers. Actually, a lot of servers. So deep down, the core Azure architecture or the architecture for any other cloud provider like AWS or GCP, the core component is still the physical servers. So do not get swayed away by the term cloud. Deep down, it's still the entire array of servers that make the cloud architecture possible. And as we have learned in the previous episodes, all these servers are hosted on cloud service providers' facilities, and these facilities are called data centers. So essentially, data centers is a cluster of multiple physical servers which are interconnected with some network. Now, as per Microsoft, Azure data centers are unique physical buildings located all over the globe, and these data centers are a group of network computer servers. And friends, at this point, I want to stress on a very important fact that each data center has its own power, cooling, and networking. To deeply understand the data centers and how they are built, how they work, and why they are still the basics of any cloud architecture, please watch the previous parts of this series. The links are shared in the description box. Now, before taking any step further, I want to show you the Azure Global Infrastructure. It's very important that you understand the basic hierarchy of Azure Global Infrastructure. I have seen many cloud professionals getting confused on this concept. But trust me friends, it's not that complex, and understanding the hierarchy of core architecture and services will go a long way in your Azure cloud career. So the Azure Global Infrastructure starts with Azure Geography. You can think Azure Geography the same as a country, although there are some exceptions and I will show you that in a quick while. But for now, let's keep it simple and consider Azure Geography as a country. Any guesses what come next? Well, it's Azure Regions. So there can be multiple Azure regions inside an Azure Geography. I will explain Azure Regions in a lot more detail in the subsequent slides. Further, inside Azure Regions, we have Azure Availability Zones. And each availability zones contain one or more data centers with independent power, cooling, and networking. Also, please note that our availability set is a combination of a fault domain and update domain. We are going to see all these concepts in a lot more detail in subsequent slides. So please pay full attention and do not skip any section so that you fully understand Azure Global Architecture. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, please do it right away as many important concepts are coming up on this Tech Blackboard channel. So let's begin with Azure Geography. As I mentioned that Azure Geography in most cases is equivalent to a country. Please remind that I said in most cases, not all. Let me show you some Microsoft documentation on Azure Geography. So this is the Microsoft official documentation on Azure Geographies. And as you can read, as per Microsoft, each Azure Geography contains one or more regions and meets specific data residency and compliance requirements. This lets you keep your business critical data and apps nearby on fault tolerant and high capacity networking infrastructure. This is a very good documentation to understand not only Azure Geography but also other core components of Azure architecture. The link for this documentation, as always, is available in the description box. Now let's explore this documentation a little bit more. If you scroll a little bit more here, you will see that Microsoft has listed all the geographies here in this drop-down box. By default, this will select the geography or the country which is the closest to you. So basically, now that I am in Sweden, that's why Sweden is the default country selected for me. And it will change for you depending upon the region or the country you are placed in. So here you can see that we are given with lot of countries, but there is one very important thing that you must pay attention to. Here you can see that we are given with the countries. For example, we have Australia, we have Austria, we have Belgium, we also have Denmark, we also have India. But very importantly, you can also see that not only countries, but there are regions as well. For example, if you see that we are given with Asia Pacific, we are also given with something which is called Azure Government, then we are given with Europe. So that means Azure geographies mostly are related to the countries, but that's not always. Sometimes Azure geographies are not equivalent to the country, but they are more related to one region. One more important concept is here, which is called Azure Government, and this concept I will cover when I will explain Sovereign Cloud in the upcoming slides. I hope you understand what are Azure geographies. Mostly they are equal to the countries, but not always. We have Azure geographies which do not one-to-one correspond with a specific country. Now let's move on and see why do I need Azure Geography in Azure Cloud. Well, there are two main reasons. The first one is low latency. Let's assume that you are a big local fashion brand and all your customers are in one country. We take the example of India. In this case, you don't want to host a website in a USA based server. Why? Because you don't want every hit on the website traveling around the world. This causes unnecessary latency, delay, slow performance, and hence poor customer experience. So basically, you want your website and data to be hosted geographically close to your customers. Since all your customers are in India, you want to make sure that your application and data is hosted in India. One way Azure ensures this is by using Azure Geographies. The other reason why we need Azure Geographies is the compliance and regulations. Regulated data like financials, healthcare, or credit card data in most cases are not allowed to leave the country. Your organization may be legally bound and be required to store such data in the same country where the operations are being carried out. And no points for guessing, Azure ensures this by using Azure Geographies. I'm sure that by now you have understood two basic concepts, Azure Data Centers and Azure Geography. Let's take one step deeper and discuss Azure Regions, which is undoubtedly one of the most important concepts. And please note that this is the beginning of our section 2.1.1. At the very core, Azure Region is a set of data centers that are connected through a dedicated low latency network. Here in this image, you can see that Azure regions are connected data centers. There is a related concept of Azure Availability Zone, but that I will explain in next section of this video. Now friends, you may ask one question here, that if there are always 3 data centers in any Azure region, well, that's not true. The number of data centers in Azure region is not fixed. There are Azure regions with different sizes. A Azure region can be made of multiple data centers. It could be 3 data centers, it could be 2 data centers, or it could also be just 1 data center. The number of Azure data centers in Azure region is not important. What actually is important is that you remember that an Azure region is a group of 1 or more data centers. Now let's see what Microsoft has to say on Azure regions. As per Microsoft, there are 60 announced regions, more than any other cloud provider. Azure makes it possible to choose data centers and region that are right for you and your customers. Now friends, it's very important that you choose your Azure region with utmost care. There should be a proper planning before you choose Azure region. The reason is very simple. Not all Azure resources are available in all the Azure region. For example, let me show you. Now on this documentation, when you click browse button here, let's say we want to provision a virtual machine. So we have to go to the compute section and then we have to select virtual machine as a product. Let's go for that. Now we can see that virtual machine, all the sizes or products of the virtual machines are given on the left hand sides, and on the right hand sides you are given with the Azure regions. Pay attention my friends that not all virtual machines, for example we have this A8 and A11, these are compute intensive virtual machines, but they are not available in Canada Central, Canada East, Central US, also not available in East US 2 and West Central US. Similarly, you can see and observe that many virtual machines are not available in many of the regions. So whenever you're choosing your Azure region, do it with proper planning. One more interesting piece of information that you can also gather from this documentation is this table key here. You can see that all the virtual machine or any of the Azure resource that is marked by this tick sign is in generally available mode. The other ones which are marked with this blue box are in preview phase. The one which are marked by this blue but solid box are in preview, and you have to hover the view expected time frame. The one you can see with this small clock here, these are future availability. For example, I can show you, if you scroll this page towards the bottom, you will see this clock sign here, which tells you that these virtual machines, this will be available in East US 2 and the expected time is also given. So Microsoft is saying that they will be available in this region in Q4 of 2022. Very interesting document. Lot of information can be gathered on this documentation from Microsoft. Now I want to show you some more interesting information on Azure Geography and Azure Regions. So once more, I am on the same documentation of Azure Geographies and I want to show you this information here. So if you come down to this section here, which says select a geography, here if you select India, so I have selected India from this drop down menu, and now you can see that here we have multiple regions. To be exact, we have 3 regions here. We have Central India, we have South India, we have South Central India. But as I mentioned earlier that not all geographies have 3 regions, let me show you one example of that. If you select Japan, here you can see that we only have 2 regions here. We have Japan East and we have Japan West. So basically in case of Japan, we only have 2 regions. On the other hand, in case of India, we had 3 regions. Not only that, you can also check the location and whether this Azure region supports the availability zone or not. Along with the region, Azure availability zones are a very important concept when you want to build highly available and resilient global applications. And we will discuss Azure Availability Zone in the upcoming slides. But before leaving this documentation, I want to stress one more time that it's very important to note that there are many regions that do not support availability zones, a very important factor to consider before you pick any region for your resources. Just be with me in this session and I will show you where exactly the regions are picked when you are creating any Azure resource. But before that, let me first show you what are the important characteristics of Azure regions, and then I will tell you why Azure regions are needed. The first important characteristic about Azure region is that some of the Azure services are only available in the specific regions. I just showed you moments ago with an example of Azure virtual machines that some of the Azure virtual machine types were not available in specific regions. Similarly, there are many Azure resources that are not available in all the Azure regions. So once again, whenever you are choosing your Azure regions, you must first consider what kind of Azure resources that you want to spin for your project. Secondly, some services are global services, so they are not tied to a specific region. For example, Traffic Manager or Azure Active Directory. Finally, there are three types of different Azure regions. The first one, which is open for everyone to access. Then we have government regions like US government. I showed you Azure government region just a little while back. Then the third type is partnered regions like China region. I will give more details on government and partnered regions in the upcoming slides when we will learn about Azure Sovereign or national clouds. Now let's look at the importance of Azure region and why they are actually needed. Firstly, Azure regions are locations for any service or Azure resource that you want to create in Azure. For example, if you want to create a virtual machine or a storage account, you will be asked to choose a Azure region. Here in this example, you can see that while creating a virtual machine, we are being asked to pick a Azure region for the same. It is worth noting that while creating pretty much any resource in Azure, Azure region is a mandatory setting, and that makes regions so important in Microsoft Azure. You must choose a region very carefully. I showed you a lot of regions in the previous parts of this video. As a thumb rule, you should pick a region closer to where you are or where your customers are. Now friends, as I promised, let me show you where exactly the regions are asked when you create any Microsoft resource. Here I am on the Microsoft Azure portal. Let's try to create some resource, and for that we will click this section here which says create a resource. So what should we create? Let's create a virtual machine. So here we go, and this is the template where you can create virtual machine in Microsoft Azure. And you can see that we are first asked to choose the subscription. So you can see that I have my subscription already selected here. In case you have multiple subscription, then all of them will be shown in this drop down menu. Moving ahead, we also have to choose the resource group. If you already have a resource group, then you can choose from this drop down menu. Otherwise, you can also create a new resource group here. Very importantly, you have to notice that we need to mention what region we want this virtual machine to be in. So Microsoft is asking us to choose the Azure region, and you can see that this region is marked by this red star, which means that this is a mandatory field. You cannot skip this. You cannot create any Azure resource without selecting Azure region. So I hope you understand where exactly the importance of Azure region is coming from. The second very important benefit is to provide fault tolerance against failure. This is also called the cross-region resiliency. So in order to make your applications highly resilient, you must deploy them in multiple Azure regions. So even if one Azure region fails, the application is still working from other regions. A related benefit of Azure region is to provide data security. to fulfill regulatory compliance. For example, you want to keep your data inside the boundaries of USA. In this case, you can deploy your application in two US regions, East US and West US. This way, you have not only built a highly resilient application, but also kept your data inside the boundaries of the country. Now let's understand what a regional pair is. Please note that we are still in the section 2.1.1. So friends, as the data center is a collection of servers, Azure region is a collection of data centers, and if you guess that the regional pair is a group of Azure regions, congratulations, you guessed it right. Azure regional pair is surely a pair of Azure region within the same geography. Now friends, on this documentation where Microsoft talks about cross-region replication in Azure, if you come to the bottom of this documentation, you will reach to this section where Microsoft is telling you about all the Azure cross-region replication pairing for all the geographies. Here you can see that we have geography and then we are given with the regional pair A and regional pair B. It's very interesting and important to note that all the regions are always in the same geography. For example, you can see that we have China here and we have China North and China East. Then we have India, which has Central India and South India. But there is one more regional pair. We have West India and South India. But friends, did I just said that the regions or the regional pair must always be in the same geography? Well, it's not 100% right. And in the same documentation, if you scroll a little bit more, you can read that Brazil South is unique because it's paired with a region outside its geography. Brazil South's secondary region is South Central US. The secondary region for South Central US is not Brazil South. So here you can see that we are given with this information. Here we are given with the geography as Brazil, and the first region pair A is Brazil South. On the other hand, the second region pair B is South Central US. So keep in mind that Brazil is one exception to the fact that region pairs are always in the same geography. Now you might be thinking why multiple regions exist in the same geography. This can be because of two reasons. As I explained in the previous section, the first reason is to build cross-region replication in Microsoft Azure. See, many organizations require high availability provided by availability zones, but sometimes the organizations are too big and they don't want to just rely on availability zones. They want a bigger resiliency for their businesses or applications. For example, in case of natural disaster, availability zones will not suffice, and in this case, building a resiliency on Microsoft regions will be a better solution. So building cross-region replication is one of the biggest benefits of Azure region pairs. And now I want to show you the benefits of cross-region replication. The first one is sequential updating. The second one is regional recovery sequence. Then we have physical isolation. And the last one is data residency. If you want to read in details about the benefits of cross-region replication, then you can come on to this documentation from Microsoft, and this one will give you more details on the benefits that I just explained in my PPT. The second benefit of Azure region pair is that it keeps your data within the boundaries of the country. So you want to build cross-region replication, but you do not want to jump the boundaries of your country. And for this, you need Azure region pairs. For more understanding, please watch the previous sections of this video. The last topic in the section 2.1.1 is Azure Sovereign region. As per Microsoft, Azure Sovereign clouds are isolated in country platforms with independent authentication, storage, and compliance requirements. Sovereign clouds are often used within the geographical boundaries where there is a strict data residency requirement. Now, some of the Azure Sovereign clouds are Azure China 21 ViaNet. Then we have Azure Germany. We also have Azure Government, which is from US, and then we have Australia. Now friends, primarily there are two types of Azure Sovereign clouds. One which is operated by Microsoft and the other one which are operated by others, or you can also say they are partnered. Coming back to the first one, which are operated by Microsoft, and a good example for the same could be Microsoft Australia. The second type of Microsoft Azure Sovereign Cloud is what I also called Partnered Sovereign Cloud. For example, China. Microsoft Azure in China is operated by 21 VNet, which is also called as Azure China. And this is physically separated instance of cloud services located just in China. And friends, this one is independently operated and transacted by Shanghai Blue Cloud Technology Corporations Limited, which is also called 21 VNet. And friends, if you want to understand what is the setup with this 21 VNet, you can come to this documentation where Microsoft has explained everything in quite some detail. It is given that what is Microsoft Azure operated by 21 VNet, what are the operations in the China, what are the agreements, pricing, and lot of other details are given in this documentation. As always, links to all the documentation that I'm referring in this video are available in the description box. This brings us to the section 2.1.2, which is going to be the last section for today, and that is availability zone. Now, as per Microsoft documentation, availability zones are physically separate locations within each Azure region that are tolerant to local failures. As I have mentioned many times in this video, each availability zone is made up of one or more data centers with independent power, cooling, and networking. Now let's check out the features and importance of availability zones that will also help us understand why actually they are needed. So availability zones are connected with high performance network with a round trip latency which is less than 2 milliseconds. The other important feature of availability zones is that not all the regions have availability zones. And in this very video, just a while back, I showed you that there are Microsoft regions which do not support availability zones. So friends, the regions that supports availability zones have a minimum of 3 separate zones to ensure resiliency. I showed you this while explaining Azure Regions, so please go back to the video and understand this better. Then my friends, with availability zones, you can design and operate applications and databases that automatically transitions between zones without interruption. Another very important benefit is that if one availability zone has gone down for some reason, we still have our application and data available from rest of the 2 availability zones. There is a physical separation between each availability zone, and it is this separation that protects our application and data from data center failures. With availability zones, Azure offers industry's best 99.99% of virtual machine uptime SLA. In case you want to know what is SLA and how the SLAs are calculated, you must watch the previous part of this video series. Now friends, some organizations require high availability of availability zones and protection from large-scale phenomena or regional disasters. So all the big organizations want to protect their applications and data in case there is a natural calamity. And Azure Regions are designed to offer protection against localized disaster with availability zones and protection from regional or large geographic disasters with disaster recovery by making use of another region. So even if one Azure region gets down, maybe due to some natural calamity or war-like situation, your application would still be served from another Azure region. So that was all for today. We learned a lot of important concepts today. Let's summarize. Today, we understood the very core of Azure architecture and services. We started with understanding Azure data centers. Then I explained you Azure Region, Azure Region Pairs, and Azure Sovereign Regions. And finally, my friends, we covered the Azure availability zones. In today's session, I have given a lot of practical examples on Azure portal along with related Microsoft documentation for each section. Please watch the video multiple times so that these core Azure concepts are very clear to you and you must understand them before you can do anything meaningful on Azure. In the coming episodes, we will cover section 2.1.4, which is describe Azure resources and Azure groups. Then we will also cover section 2.1.5, which is describe subscription. And then we will also cover section 2.1.6, which is describe management groups. And the final section, which we will cover under this main section, which is describe Azure architecture and services, that section would be section 2.1.7, which is describe the hierarchy of resource groups, subscriptions, and management groups. Besides that, we will also cover availability sets, fault domain, and update domain. A lot of people keep getting confused between fault domain and update domain, and they also are confused what is the exact difference between availability set and availability zone. So all these are super important to understand as they are very closely connected to Azure Regions, Azure Availability Zones, and of course they are principal services to build truly scalable and resilient cloud solution. A lot of interesting and knowledgeable stuff is coming up in the next episodes. So please do not miss to subscribe. You can also join us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where we keep posting short format videos for quick learning. Thank you so much for your valuable time and learning with us. I will see you in the next video. Till then, stay fit, keep learning, and thanks for watching.
If this video has added any value in your learning, a like and subscribe is highly appreciated. Share this video in your family and friends to spread and expand their learning. Your comments and feedback give me a chance to interact with you, and I look forward for them. We will meet again in our next video. Till then, stay fit, keep learning, and thanks for watching.